Welcome again today to our update on the water situation. Today's going to be a lot of statistical and a lot of information on what has happened, why it's happened, where we've been able to release, etc. So it's going to get very specific and detailed, and so I'm going to let Allison really take this and use her expertise to explain what we've done and are going to do.
Good afternoon. As the mayor said, we want to kind of go through and walk through what we've released to date, why we've released that, talk about this contamination that's in the water supply, and why we're able to release certain parts of the city and others that are not. So I want to start with explaining, I know we discussed it at the press conference yesterday in regards to the high plain and why we released that, and then also the additional areas. So as we discussed yesterday, the high plain for our water distribution system is hydraulically separated from the other portion. Due to the elevations that fluctuate through San Angelo, we have to push water from the water treatment plant to the high plain, and it is valved or physically separated from the low plain, and that helps maintain pressure on a normal day of operation in that high plain. This is common for utilities to operate different pressure planes. So that explains that high plain rationale we worked through with TCEQ, explaining our system, and that way everybody felt comfortable releasing that high plain. We did that same concept and kind of work through with TCEQ yesterday. We have a hydraulic model of our water system that we use, and so it simulates water pumping out of the water treatment facility. It shows where it gives directional flow through our water lines in this model that show on normal day water is flowing through this pipe from left to right, south, north, those type of directions. So I'm going to try to utilize the map if I can to show y'all while still trying to talk in the mic. Water treatment plant is located approximately here. And so the area south of that water treatment facility, we were able to release because we're able to model that the water being distributed, from the treatment facility, all of that water is being pushed from the treatment facility south. It has been determined that this is not a source water contamination from the test results or from the area and from we'll discuss test results here in a minute, but it is not a source water contamination. This is either a backflow fail or it's a issue there. So through the modeling, we were able to show that water moves from the water treatment plant through this southern part of the lower plain that wasn't originally released. And so this includes Goodfellow, the Butler Farms, the southern part of town here, and that's why we were able to release that area. We have been sampling. We have been taking samples since day one of receiving the massive amount of complaints in the Paulan area. Yesterday, we did perform more testing. What we're trying to do is to test a containment area or all the lines that are feeding into the Paulan area. So we look in our distribution system every way that water travels in and out of the Paulan area. And so we are pulling samples yesterday all throughout that containment zone. We have not received the results from yesterday's sampling. We did even more sampling this morning of a secondary sweep that's a little bit further out from those main feeds of Paulan, just as a precaution so that we can see what those results produce. The TCEQ is also doing some sampling of their own, but that is what the city has done. We want to discuss what you can do in the green areas versus if you're still in the white zones of this map. So in the green, because it wasn't, I know under a bull water notice, we talk about flushing your lines and those type of things, but that is due to, there could have been, bacteria or something in the line. Here, this was determined that this system, it's not a source water issue, so these areas did not receive the water. Water doesn't travel from down here up through Paul Ann and back around. That's just not how our distribution system works. So this water is fresh water from the plant, and that's why we've been able to determine and put it into the area or the out of the do not use order. So the green areas, you can resume using water as you normally did prior to this event. The white areas are still under the do not use. You can use it for flushing or irrigating. The other thing that a lot of people have been discussing is the issue in Florida and the hacking that went along with that. So from what I know of that scenario is that they were hacked at their water treatment facility by their SCADA system. And the SCADA system is the technology that allows a water treatment plant to operate through computers and those type of things. Once again, this was not a attack or anything that happened at our water treatment facility. So therefore, we do have a SCADA system, but it was not hacked, and chemicals weren't leached at the treatment facility or anything like that. We do think this is just a failed backflow, so contaminants got back into the water supply. With that, I am going to introduce Josh Berryhill. He is a consulting engineer that we've hired specifically to assist us through this process. He's going to talk about why sampling takes so long, why we have to send samples off to areas like Austin where we've been sending them. And then he's also going to talk about some of the contaminants that were in the results of Monday's sampling. So this is the results that were, or the water samples that were pulled on Monday when we started receiving those calls, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So first thing to look at with this is, with the type of contaminants that we were considering that might be out there, working with TCEQ to try to identify what those potential contaminants were, the first thing you have to start with is what your observations are. Some of the initial complaints came back noticing smells that had a smell something like mothballs from that. So it was an odor that came from the water pretty easily. That generally implies that it's what's known as a volatile organic carbon. Volatile organic carbons are compounds that when you put them into a water, let's say a glass of water, they don't want to stay in water. They're going to evaporate from that water very quickly. A good way to think about it in comparison is anybody who goes to fill up their gas tank at a gas station, when they're filling that up, they notice the smell of gasoline. The reason for that is volatile organic carbons that are in the fuel that evaporate out of the fuel itself, the liquid phase, and get into the air, and that's what you smell. That's what's known as an aromatic ring that creates that specific smell. Now, why I'm bringing this up is, in working with TCEQ to try to identify what these contaminants were, the first thing we have to look at is what tests are available that would give us some idea of what's in the water. So one of the procedures that's available from the EPA is known as a test for testing other volatile organic carbons. There are certain contaminants that we find in drinking water that are either the result of the water treatment process itself. These are regulated components or constituents that are mandated under the primary drinking water standards with the EPA and the TCEQ. But there are a lot of other compounds that are out there. Some are natural, some are man-made, some we find in industrial areas like cleaners, solvents. Some we can find, again, out in nature. Now, many of those other compounds, though, are not regulated by the EPA or the TCEQ in drinking water because you rarely ever see them there. They're not part of water treatment, so they're generally not a typical process. So this process, this test method that we have to use, it's known as EPA 524.2 for testing all of these other potential volatile organic carbons. So you take these samples, and there are currently only 2 labs in Texas that are what are known as NELAC certified for testing for these volatile organic carbons. There are other labs that can test for this in Texas, but there are currently only 2 labs that we're aware of that TCEQ recognizes as that have the appropriate certification processes for quality control and assurance. So to ensure we test these, we test the samples, we get these results, and we can rely on these results for making a regulatory decision at the state level or federal level. So unfortunately, that process, the 524.2 process, takes anywhere from 12 to 24 hours for that sample to be processed. The nearest facility for the city of San Angelo to use is in Austin. That's with the LCRA lab, and that is one of the labs that is a typical lab that TCEQ uses for testing water quality samples throughout the state of Texas. So unfortunately, what that means is the samples that were taken on Monday, they were overnight shipped to the LCRA lab. They were received Tuesday morning, yesterday morning at LCRA. They began processing those yesterday, and preliminary results were received late in the day yesterday. City staff and ourselves, we went over that data. We shared that data with TCEQ to provide comment. We've had discussions with TCEQ today on that data. And now I can kind of share a few of those with you. A detailed discussion of those contaminants that were identified specifically from that first day of samples in Monday. So those were samples that were taken specifically within the complaint area in the Paul Ann neighborhood. Subsequent samples, as Allison mentioned, have been taken as we've gone away from the original contamination area and have started developing these outer perimeters, trying to determine the ultimate scope and breadth of where these contaminants are. We had one set of where we extended the perimeter yesterday. We took those samples yesterday morning. Those samples were delivered to LCRA late yesterday afternoon, right around the time of yesterday's press conference. Those are in process right now. We unfortunately have not received those results yet. And a third set with a further expansion of the perimeter. We did another set of those samples this morning, and those are already en route to LCRA, and I think they've already been delivered as of right now. So unfortunately, though, because of this process, so even though now we know what those contaminants are, we still have to use that same testing method, which means it's still 12 to 24 hours before we can get those results back. Now, of the contaminants that we've identified, the 3 major contaminants that have shown up in the water samples are benzene, which is a solvent, acetone, which is also a solvent. So any ladies that may get their nails done know exactly what acetone is. And then the third component, unfortunately, is a compound known as naphthalene. So this is a compound that can be used as a pesticide because it has a very strong odor. So it tends to drive off animals from the smell of it. But it's also used in many other industrial processes. So it's not necessarily, no one should jump to the conclusion that we have found naphthalene in the water, so that means there's a bunch of pesticide in the water. It is used as an ingredient in certain pesticides, but it's not a pesticide in and of itself. Now, with all that being said, of those contaminants, as well as some additional minor contaminants that were measured just above the detection limit of this process, we will be releasing that information, or the city will be releasing that information very soon. One of the things we're also planning to release with that is a contaminant informational package that has specific information on each of the contaminants that were identified in the water, what the common uses are, and then what are the different risks. So some of these chemicals have an ingestion risk. So if you drink water with this chemical in it, there are certain impacts that are certain effects that you might expect. Many of these compounds, though, again, they're volatile organic carbons, which means they want to get out of the water as fast as possible. So in many cases, these chemicals have more of a risk as an inhalation hazard, which means breathing it in as it off gases, as opposed to drinking it with it in the water. That's the biggest reason why TCEQ early on said, let's not do a boil water notice, let's do a stop use, do not use order for the water. Because if you were to boil that water, all it's going to do is make those chemicals come out of that water faster. So until we knew what it was and knew what that potential risk was, we needed to hold off on trying to just do a boil water notice. With that being said, going forward, again, we've collected additional sets of samples with the idea being trying to further narrow down the isolation zone more and more. The city is actively working with TCEQ to develop a flushing plan for the contaminated zone. But part of that, before we can implement that, going into the flushing process, is ideally trying to identify the source of the contamination. That's something that's ongoing. So the good news and bad news from that. The good news is so far what we're seeing from odor complaints, from staff observations out in the field, is the smell coming from the water is reducing day by day. That makes sense because with volatile organic carbons, that's going to off-gas. So it's going to naturally disperse as fast as it can as soon as water is exposed to the atmosphere. The problem with that, unfortunately, is it makes our job much more difficult to try to pinpoint that original source. So that effort is still ongoing. We're going to keep working with TCEQ on that. TCEQ has sent multiple personnel to the city to help with doing field inspections of facilities. They're augmenting cities called CSIs, customer service inspections of different facilities that either have a backflow preventer or in some cases, it's a facility that had a small enough water demand that did not have a backflow preventer, and we're checking all of those as well. And this is a very common thing, unfortunately, throughout the United States. Not every commercial or industrial utility or building has a backflow preventer. So again, we're going step by step. We're checking each of the facilities that have registered backflow preventers to make sure they're fully functional, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then beyond that, we're also looking at any other industries in the area that could have also contributed to this.
Thank you, Josh. One thing I just want to wrap up before we open it up for questions is that this is a lengthy process, and we understand that this is a severe inconvenience to our customers, but what we want to do is keep our customers safe. And so while we understand the inconvenience and the lifestyle change that this is probably causing on families and businesses, we want to make sure that we're keeping our customers safe through the process. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Victor Glenn, KLST News. Do we have an idea of how many homes or households are still in the do not use area?
I do not have a home count for that.
And with O.C. Fisher in close proximity to the part of the city that's still in the do not use zone, have testing samples been taken from O.C. Fisher to see if this is extended beyond municipal water systems?
No. Are you saying, have we tested in O.C. Fisher itself?
Yes.
No, this is not a source water contamination. So when I say source water, what I'm talking about is this is not coming from Lake Nasworthy, the Concho River, Twin Buttes, the Hickory groundwater supply. Those are our source waters. These contaminants are not coming from those sources. They're coming from an industry or commercial customer or something to that effect into our distribution system, into our treated water system. So no, we have not tested O.C. Fisher specifically, but we also aren't currently using O.C. Fisher due to the water levels. But the customers, the wholesale customers that we serve off the white area of this map are still in the do not use order.
Now, it was mentioned that you all were checking industrial sites that had backflow preventers. Is that the general working theory right now, that the benzene, acetone, and naphthalene came from an industrial site as opposed to runoff from any other operation outside the area?
So it has, you said runoff, but that would be mostly coming into our sewer system if it were running or runoff. We're going to commercial customers because that's usually where they have pumps and processes that are pressurizing different chemicals, solvents, those type of things throughout their facility. That's not typical of a household use.
And then finally, in terms of remediation plan, I know that flushing the system was mentioned. Are there any other steps that y'all can plan for without yet knowing the source?
Right now, we want to know that contamination boundary, the samples that we've started taking yesterday and today. Once we know that boundary and we can truly isolate that slug of water and where it is located, we will implement a flushing plan through hydrants so that we make sure we bring completely fresh water throughout the entire system. And then your secondary question was what?
Further remediation steps beyond flushing the system.
From there, it's also going to be just the backflow, the customer service inspections, those type of things as we go through all those different facilities.
Thank you.
These questions for Mayor. Is there anything specific that the city is doing to help the disabled or elderly who couldn't leave their homes to get water this morning?
Yes, we are. We called Meals for the Elderly today and are working with them to help us distribute water. I think they have the best contact for a lot of elderly people, disabled people that might need water. So we are doing that as a first step. We have certainly taken some phone calls from people, and we've addressed their needs and given them an option in terms of things that could be done for them. But we are not going to ignore those disabled or those handicapped. It's just very difficult to know which households are which, so it's not easily identified, and so we don't know what those issues are. But I think Meals for the Elderly is really well known in terms of taking care of those people who are in need. And so for us, that was one of the first phone calls that we made this afternoon to ensure that that is addressed.
Perfect. And lastly, do you have any idea if we're going to continue the water distribution tomorrow as well, if this continues on?
Yes, we are. Obviously, we're going to still stay very focused in the Coliseum, but we are looking at perhaps another location for the white area two other locations that might help. With this much territory that has been opened up, it obviously makes it easier for us to have a location, or will be 3 locations to better address those households that have a need.
Okay, one last question. I spoke to some residents specifically about the water supply, like at HEB, and they have concerns about water, possibly running low, like toilet paper, for instance. Do you have any, response to that right now?
I do. They have assured us that they have a lot of water and more water constantly coming in. So we would ask that we don't start to hoard. But again, with this much of the territory of the city opened up, with their ability to use their water, and with the supplies that our partners, business community partner themselves, I don't believe we're going to have a water issue, supply issue within our retail stores.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Question for you, Mayor. Have you reached out to Shannon by any chance? Obviously, with the pandemic going on and water being a main source, have you reached out to them how they can be assisted in this?
Number one, obviously last night late, we were able to open up Community South, or I should say Shannon South, excuse me for that. And so they do have that facility open now. As it relates to how they are operating the existing facility, they have not reached out to us, or me specifically. Daniel, I think, has information or an update in his conversation with Shane Plymouth.
I am on daily contact with Shane Plymouth, who's the CEO of Shannon Hospital. Also Pam, who's over the director of nurses, just to get information to them, to let them know exactly where we are. And it's not just Shannon Hospital. I am in touch also with Dr. Detloff, in touch with the community partners that we have that are being affected at this point, Colonel Maz. So I want to make sure that we're updating them so they can plan appropriately. But yes, as far as Shannon Hospital, absolutely, we are really in contact on a daily basis. And we give them the updates they need to plan for what they need to be doing.
Gotcha. And I guess a question for Ms. Allison. Have you guys been able to pinpoint where this all started, with naphthane being part of an industrial, and this was first came out as an industrial chemical problem? Have you been able to pinpoint where this all started?
No, we have not been able to pinpoint the source of the contamination at this point, but that is actively what we are doing ourselves and with TCEQ.
Gotcha. And for the rest of the area on white, how do you determine when it can now go into the green? Last night, my living area, along with many others, had to wait till 11:30. How do you decide when it's safe for people to use the water?
Last night, this other part that we released was through ensuring through our model, working with TCEQ, discussing our distribution system, and making sure everybody felt comfortable in knowing that water through this area is only fed from our water treatment facility. So it was just analyzing our system. And so, yes, it was late, but we wanted to make sure that the area that we were releasing was safe, and that when they woke up in the morning or whenever, they had the ability to use that water.
Gotcha. And I know this is the first time for everybody, but how can we avoid this from happening again in our community?
We need, I think Mayor talked about it yesterday. We aren't through this process yet, and so we haven't gotten to the lessons learned and how we're going to proactively go forth from this crisis or this issue. And so I think that as we work through this, we will have many lessons learned and, procedures that we'll be putting in place.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elena Edgen with the newspaper. And I'm not sure if the mic is low enough for me yet. So I had several questions coming in from the public. And I know that you've addressed that we don't know all the answers just yet. But at the end of this investigation, which could be however long, could there be any charges filed?
We don't know that at this time.
Okay. And have there been any recorded sicknesses in people or animals so far?
I've just only heard of the issues or the smell complaints. I haven't heard of any sickness in those areas.
Okay. And for how many commercial businesses in that area use that combination of chemicals? Is that known yet?
No, that is what we're working on currently.
Okay. As the investigation continues, do we have an idea of rough timeline on...
Do you mind speaking into the mic, please? You just step up close to it.
Sorry. Is this good?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I know that we're still investigating. How long could this investigation possibly take? Do we have a rough timeline? I know we have businesses who are hoping to be open for Valentine's Day, and that's been a big concern.
I think the answer that nobody wants to hear is at this time we don't know. We're working as expeditiously around the clock as we can. And so I don't want to provide a timeline that may not be able to be met. So all I can tell you is we're actively working on this. We won't stop until we get this issue complete. And so right now there are no timelines for when everything will be cleared.
Thank you.
Matt Tram, Wilson, Angelo Live. So first of all, one of the things over there, there's a lot of construction going on right now and a lot of industrial places over there. When they hook into the main water lines, they use safety check valves. Is that where y'all are starting to look at? Is there maybe a way that they bypass those check valves or anything like that?
So our engineering group handles all the inspection of construction as contractors lay new water lines and those type of things, and they are specifically looking for those. They are ensuring that construction plans are installed as designed. So I can tell you that when we go to inspect a subdivision and those type of things as water lines are being extended, that's being handled through our inspection division and analyzed very closely.
Another thing is they could, or let me phrase this right so that way it's all right. With the check valves, could it be something that just happened right now, or not with the check valves, but with the contamination itself? Could it have been something that could have happened weeks ago that we're just now knowing about, or is it something that is happening right now?
I think that once we pinpoint the source right now, as Josh talked about, the locations that we are going to continuously, we're not finding that odor being present. So it is volatilizing off. So this could have been a one-time event. It could have gone on for a couple days, just at slow volumes or small volumes. But once we get to finding a source or, pinpointing in a location, we will know better, kind of that information.
I also have a question for you. Just kind of, in layman's terms, give me the, so at the end you kind of emphasize that the naphthalene was in the water, and you kind of emphasize, is there anything worse that the naphthalene is than the other two contaminants, or are they all the same, or just kind of what is so bad about naphthalene and the contaminants in the water?
The biggest issue with all of these is they're not intended for human consumption, none of them. Benzene is something that we do find in water from time to time, so there is what's known as an MCL, a maximum contaminant level established by the EPA. But for acetone, for naphthalene, they're not regulated by the EPA or by the TCEQ in drinking water because it's never intended to ever be in there. The saving grace with those is the biggest issue with them is inhalation. So again, as I mentioned earlier, that was the reason for the do not use order as opposed to boil water, because we didn't want people to become more exposed to that inhalation. Ideally, if anything, we wanted it to stay trapped in the water until we could flush it out in a safe manner, so it wouldn't be off-gassing in people's households and affecting families. With regard to levels of danger or risk with each of those different chemicals, there's essentially, in most cases, within any of these chemicals that are not intended for human consumption, there's always the potential of nausea, of stomach cramps, things like that. But generally, in most cases, when you look at requirements for risk assessment evaluation, in many cases, many of these chemicals, they'll say, yes, if you drink this with a high dose, it could cause these effects. Generally, what they're referring to is not that you're drinking water that has some of this chemical in it that are in very, very small concentrations. They're talking about, like as an example, acetone. You could go to a store and buy a bottle of nail polish remover, which the main component is acetone. No one expects anyone to drink directly from that bottle of acetone. But that has a significantly higher, that's orders of magnitude. It could be 1,000 or 1,000,000 times higher concentration in that bottle of pure acetone as opposed to what we're seeing in this water. So that's why they're not currently regulated by is there a risk of this causing death to someone or putting someone in the hospital? Very unlikely because of how low these concentrations are. But by the same token, the reason that we started the do not use order to begin with was that at the time, we had no idea what was in there. We knew something was in there and likely a volatile chemical because of the fact of the smell that it was coming off of the water. But at that point, you don't know what it is and what the concentration is, so you don't want to take any chances. You don't want to issue the boil water notice.
With your experience in this, do you know any, or what kind of companies or anything like that, or is it construction, or is it this that type they use those type of chemicals?
When you look at chemicals like acetone and benzene, those are found in so many different products as solvents that they work really well of dissolving a solid substance into a liquid form. So that's why we call it, that's why it's known as a solvent. So a common solvent, most people, they don't think of it in terms of solvent. Most people have ever heard of a phrase called like paint thinner. Paint thinner has a solvent in it. It's not necessarily one of these chemicals, but that's that, again, kind of taking that to the real world of what you might think of. But again, that's when you're looking at, again, dissolved in water. So to give you a point of reference, when we think about water safety, the city's water treatment plant, one of the components of that treatment plant includes adding a disinfectant to the water. We add chlorine. To make sure that it's stable, we add another chemical to it to make chloramine. It makes a more stable disinfectant that stays out in distribution. It makes sure that it keeps that water safe for human consumption for days away from the water treatment plant and distribution. We think about those chemicals in terms of milligrams per liter or parts per million. Either connotation works. So the goal for, say, having a total chlorine residual in the distribution system in drinking water is generally somewhere in the range of 0.5 milligrams per liter up to about 4 milligrams per liter. All of these compounds that we're going to be talking about as we release the data, as we compile to show, here's the data that was collected on day one, on Monday, and then here's the data once we have it available, once we receive it back from the lab for day 2, and so on. One issue is we expect to see significantly lower levels in the second day as well as in the third day, because again, these volatile chemicals want to get out of the water as fast as they can. But just in terms of concentration, what we're looking at is as one example of one compound. These compounds we're looking at not in terms of milligrams per liter, but micrograms per liter. So in other words, 1 milligram per liter is equal to 1,000 micrograms per liter. So these numbers for disinfectants that we want to have in the water, we're looking at in terms of milligrams per liter. Like we want 2 milligrams per liter of total chlorine in the drinking water to keep it disinfected and safe for everyone to use. These chemicals we're talking about in the range of 5 or 10 or 50 or 100 micrograms per liter. So it is literally, we're talking about hundreds of times greater concentration of the safe chemical we're looking for chlorine, as opposed to these very small chemical concentrations.
So with levels this low, do we still feel it's necessary if they keep going down to keep these people without water?
Unfortunately, yes. And the reason for that is there's a specific process that the city has to work through with TCEQ to make sure that everyone has a safe level of comfort. The last thing that the city wants to do is keep anybody without water 1 minute longer. But there's a difference between making effective changes and on efficient, timely changes to the system to allow getting release of the do not use order for the rest of the area in white, versus cutting corners and potentially putting someone at risk. So we're at a point where initially on Monday we were able to qualitatively identify potentially the area of contamination, mainly due to the smell that was off-gassing from the water. Now we follow that up with then quantitative evaluation, which is collecting samples and going to the lab. The downside of that is the time it takes to get those lab results back. Now we're essentially at a point, that was why yesterday during the day we were able to release the high pressure plane. That was a fairly straightforward evaluation between the city and TCEQ. Unfortunately, the second stage that we were able to release late last night, that wasn't an arbitrary decision made at 11:30. That was through discussions and coordination with TCEQ from about 5 o'clock all the way until about 10:30 that night, blessed by TCEQ to make sure again that we weren't releasing anything we shouldn't yet, but that we were doing this in a methodical manner that was well communicated back and forth between the city and TCEQ at all stages. And the subsequent, ideally, the subsequent additional stages of further reducing that do not use order zone in white, taking more and more of this into the green as soon as possible, we're getting to the point where we really need these additional data sets to come back from the lab to where we can say, okay, as we've been adjusting that boundary, now anything outside of that boundary, we now know unequivocally from the city standpoint, from the TCEQ standpoint, that we're safe and we're ready to be able to release that next section. So we're working hard on it. So is TCEQ, but unfortunately it's a painful, slow process, and the biggest reason is because of the time it takes to do the lab samples, and we have to have it from a lab that does have all the proper QA, QC qualifications for it, so that it is documentable from the city standpoint and from the TCEQ standpoint.
Just my final question. This is for Allison. This is kind of a small one. In the green area, there are little bitty little sections of. Are those still white?
This area?
Yes, that's.
So that area is out of the city limits. That is an undeveloped area. This is Cox Lane here.
Oh, okay.
So that's just pasture land that hasn't been annexed into the city.
There's no water there. That's why it's.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you.